Hello and welcome to the final presentation of the Nutritionist 2019. I'm Marianne Fessenden from AMTS. We do not normally have a webinar in December. We're running the webinar that we had to postpone in May. As a reminder to those listening, our format is to deliver recorded presentations at 2 times on the webinar day, and the presenter joins us at the end for questions from the audience. These educational webinars are multinational. We have several co-hosts who join to deliver the presentations translated into their country's language and field questions from their countrymen. Paula Torillo joins in Argentina and co-hosts all the evening webinars. My other co-hosts can include Elena Bonfante of Dairy Innovations Italia in Italy, Sean Lee of AnSci in China, Marcos Neve Piera of Universidade Federal de Lavras in Brazil, Vadim Bekchebnikov of Nova Lab, and Marcelo Ramos of 3R Lab in Brazil. While some of my co-hosts may not be able to rebroadcast in their own language, their questions give an opportunity for consideration of viewpoints of concerns in different farming systems. Depending on how you are listening, you could submit queries through me or one of my attending co-hosts. Later, a complete recording of archived webinars as well as a question and answer session for each will be available on the AMTS website. For those of you who would listen to the presentations whilst driving, we have converted the videos to MP3 files that can be downloaded for offline listening. These podcasts can be found at the Ag Model Systems website under the Webinar tab or Resources tab. Our goal with the Nutritionist webinar series is to bring information about ruminant nutrition that is important to you. Our next speaker, Dr. Jim Drackley from the University of Illinois, is a well-respected and noted teacher and researcher in several areas of dairy nutrition. One of his areas of specialty is the nutritional management of baby calves to improve health and growth. He has received numerous awards for his research and has worked with dairy and industry groups around the world. Jim is presently working on the much-anticipated update of the Dairy NRC. Our intent was to have a presentation on the new recommendations. Jim indicates they are not yet ready. He has graciously offered to return in 2020 for a webinar as soon as the NRC is released. He has taken time out of his busy schedule today to talk about factors that may be responsible for lower colostrum production. For some producers, this is a seasonal or repeated problem. Jim's brief talk will look at the causes and ways to combat the problem. Please now enjoy Jim's very timely presentation. Remember to jot down any questions you have during the presentation and type them in the Q&A window or the chat window. We will have an opportunity for Jim to answer those questions after the presentation.
Well, thank you, Marianne, and welcome everybody to this webinar. I'm pleased to be invited in to discuss this topic about colostrum, kind of from the other side of what we usually talk about, and that's what affects colostrum yield from the cow and also colostrum quality. Our question today then is largely, does how we feed and manage dry and transition cows affect colostrum quality or colostrum yield? So every year, I know a number of my colleagues also get questions about why colostrum yield seems to be low from their cows. And it seems to be centered in late summer or fall, at least for my area. It often is transient and short-lived, but it seems to happen almost every year. We often hear that it has to be something to do with dry period nutrition, but we'll ask today and try to answer whether that's really true. So our objectives that I hope to address this afternoon are shown here. First, we're going to look at how colostrum is formed and how the process is regulated. Second, how does the mammary gland transition from colostrum to milk? Third, does maternal nutrition influence composition or yield of colostrum? Fourth, what other management factors or environmental factors might affect colostrum quality and yield? And finally, we'll wrap up with what my impressions are and some things that I can recommend, or at least possibilities for people to look at. Let's start with looking at the physical characteristics and chemical composition of colostrum and milk. Probably most of you have seen something like this before. But remember that colostrum has a high specific gravity. It's more dense than mature milk. And that's because of all the solids that it contains. Very high in solids content, often twice as high as mature milk in terms of its total solids percentage. That total solids percentage is higher because of higher fat, solids non-fat, and protein. And if we look specifically, the protein, much of that increase in protein comes from the increase in immunoglobulins. You can see here 6% compared with just 0.09% in regular milk. And the IgG fraction of the immunoglobulins makes up a good portion of that. Lactose is actually lower than mature milk, so there are very marked differences in composition between colostrum and mature milk. And somehow the mammary gland of the cow has to make this transition from producing colostrum to producing mature milk in a very short time. We know the importance of colostrum as the first line of defense for the newborn calf. Certainly needing to get the antibodies or immunoglobulins to the intestinal absorption sites before the bacteria arrive there. Hopefully we don't see too many heifers with this type of calving environment, but I know that probably all of us have seen something similar over time. It's generally considered that we need to have at least 100 grams of IgG consumed by the calf soon after birth in order to provide adequate immune protection. The amount of IgG consumed by the calf, of course, is a product of the concentration of IgG in the colostrum in terms of grams per liter and the volume of colostrum fed in liters or quarts. So there's several ways to get similar amounts of IgG into the calf, of course. If we feed 2 liters that has a concentration of 50 grams per liter, we get 100 grams of intake. If that 2 liters only contains 35 grams per liter, then the calf only consumes 70 grams of IgG. If we have lower quality colostrum, again only 35 grams per liter, but feed 3 liters, then we still manage to get 105 grams of IgG into the calf. We want the highest quality colostrum available that we can feed in the least amount to ensure that we have adequate intake of IgG by the calf. So we want high quality colostrum. If the yield is limited, then we don't have any extra available to feed other calves or to freeze in case of subsequent calvings that do not have enough colostrum to feed. So this problem of low yield is compounded and can present an ongoing problem to producers in trying to manage the newborn calves. High yields of poor colostrum are suitable to feed older calves, but really don't do the job for us on the newborns. Another challenge that we have is the extreme variability even under the best of times. And if we look at some of the variability in experiments that have measured colostrum, this is a study, or 2 studies from the University of Minnesota when Noah Litherland and his colleagues were working there. And it shows again the difference among cows along the x-axis with their colostrum yield here shown on the y-axis. You can see that the average here in the green line is fairly high, but we can see by the number of cows that are below the blue line here, which is 5 kilograms yield, which would be considered to be an adequate yield, is still too many cows. This study from Penn State University shows, again, the variation in colostrum concentration, or IgG1 concentration versus colostrum volume in the left-hand figure, and also shows colostrum mass versus colostrum volume in the right-hand panel. And as you can see, there's no clear relationship between either one of these. However, it's likely that cows regulate the total mass or total amount of IgG that they transport into the mammary gland, and that is variably diluted then with liquid. So with that, let's switch to discuss a little bit about the stages of lactation development. First, we have mammogenesis, which is the growth and differentiation of the mammary tissue and gland structure. Then we have lactogenesis 1, which is colostrum formation, followed by lactogenesis 2, which is the initiation of milk secretion itself. And then we have lactopoiesis, which is maintenance of milk production throughout the lactation. These stages are all driven by classic hormones in the cow. The mammogenic stage relies on estrogens, progesterone, prolactin, and growth hormone. The lactogenesis is determined by prolactin, insulin, and glucocorticoids, and the lactopoietic effects are maintained by growth hormone, glucocorticoids, thyroid hormones, insulin, parathyroid hormone, and prolactin, at least in the goat and the ewe. So let's look specifically at colostrum synthesis. The immunoglobulin G fraction, or IgG, is accumulated in the mammary secretions over time. If we look in the bloodstream, we find IgG1 and IgG2 in about equal concentrations in the cow's blood, but only IgG1 gets concentrated into colostrum. So this is a specific receptor-mediated process called receptor-mediated transcytosis. We get accumulation of other proteins from the blood via leaky cell-to-cell junctions rather than specific transport into the gland. And then we have passive movement of water and electrolytes into the colostral secretions. Here's a diagram of 3 mammary cells, and we'll look at some of the different transport processes to think about how colostrum is formed. To orient you, on the bottom of the figure, we have the blood, the basement membrane of the mammary gland. And so that has to, materials have to cross to get into the interstitial space here between the 3 mammary cells that are shown as examples. Out here in the top, we have the alveoli, or the alveolar lumen, where milk components will be secreted into and which will join into the collecting ducts and eventually be removed from the cow via the teat. So the first process that happens to put components into colostrum and milk is the secretory granules, which is how casein and lactose are produced. Those granules fuse with the membrane, and the contents are released into the alveolar lumen. Second, milk fat or lipids get into the secretions by budding with the cell membrane. The milk fat globule membrane surrounding the lipid is pushed out into the alveolar lumen and then breaks off to release a droplet of lipid into milk or colostrum. 3, we have passive movement of water according to the ionic gradients or osmotic pressure. And then 4th, we have this transcytosis process that we just mentioned, where vacuoles containing IgG are transported first into the cell, as shown in the bottom of the figure, and then across the cell to the other membrane of the alveoli, where the contents again are released into the alveolus. This is a pH-dependent process also, quite a complex phenomenon and unique to the transport of protein molecules such as the IgGs. We also have passage of molecules between the leaky tight junctions, as shown here in number 5. We have diapedesis, which is how cells can move between mammary cells. So things like white blood cells that are able, or somatic cells that are able to get into milk. Then we have the milk fat globule membrane that may carry additional materials with the milk fat globule into milk. And finally, the process where immunoglobulins are transferred or recycled back into the interstitial space rather than being secreted into milk. So this would help maintain antibodies or immunoglobulins circulating within the tissue rather than being secreted in milk. So many different processes involved in formation of both colostrum and milk. Many of these are similar. Some of them are emphasized or prominent only in one or the other, such as the transcytosis process that we've discussed. This whole process begins more than 5 weeks before parturition. It will accelerate during the estrogen rise and progesterone fall that happens during the last 5 to 7 days prepartum, and then is stopped by the cortisol or glucocorticoid surge that happens at calving. As we transition to milk synthesis, lactose synthesis is the key. Lactose will draw water into milk. Alpha-lactalbumin, which is a whey protein present in milk, is a component of the enzyme system that makes lactose, the lactase synthetase enzyme. And this is a marker of lactation, so it can be used to understand when the mammary cells are switching over to normal milk production. At this time also we'll have increased synthesis of casein and milk fat. The component synthesis of milk then is turned on by the increasing estrogen, decreasing progesterone, and increasing prolactin that occur right before parturition. The surge of cortisol around parturition completes this activation, and the hormonal changes together cause the tight junctions to form between the cells, so we eliminate this leaky junction that will allow other components to leak into milk. One of the interesting things that's kind of hard to get your head around is that we can have colostrogenesis or colostrum synthesis and milk synthesis going on at the same time. They're essentially independent processes. So cows that are continuously milked with no dry off or no dry period begin to make colostrum at the same time relative to calving, when they still may be producing a small amount of milk. So depending on the concurrent milk yield, the IgG content of that colostrum could be quite low as it's being diluted by milk. Here's a diagram of these hormonal changes that kind of makes it easier to see when things are changing. So if we look at the dotted line here running through the figure, that is meant to indicate parturition or calving. If we look at the top panel here, we have alpha-lactalbumin, that component of lactase synthetase, which is again a marker of active milk synthesis and lactose production. We can see that begins to increase at around 5 to 7 days prior to parturition. As progesterone begins to fall, estrogen begins to increase quite steeply, as does prolactin. And then at calving, glucocorticoids will surge and cause the cessation of immunoglobulin transport and also the activation of milk synthesis. Growth hormone is also increasing at this time and will become an important player in the initiation of lactation. The red line here is meant to indicate when these processes are starting, so that you can see the coordination of the different events. Now that we've looked at how colostrum is formed and what the transition is into milk synthesis, let's consider some of the nutritional factors. Does dry period nutrition affect either colostrum quality or yield? Unfortunately, if we look through the scientific literature, there's a scarcity of data for cows. A few examples will show that there's no clear picture that emerges. Here's a study from our research program several years in which we had a controlled energy high forage program, the CEHF. A group fed a higher energy density diet so that they were overfed energy during the dry period, or a two-stage dry cow program where we had a low energy far-off period and a higher energy close-up period. The colostrum IgG content, as you can see, was similar across all 3 dry period treatments, and the colostrum weight did not differ across those 3 treatments as well. And the B superscript there is missing. It's meant to show that that was the first colostrum only taken within a few hours after calving. Another study from our group showed or compared a single group low energy dry cow diet with a far off and close-up group. Again, no difference in the first milking yield or the colostral IgG content, or the product of those two, the total IgG mass secreted in the first colostrum milking. A study from Noah Litherland at the University of Minnesota looked at wheat straw or orchard grass hay in combination with a corn or a molasses liquid feed supplement in 4 different treatments. You can see that dry matter intake varied somewhat across the 4 treatments. Colostrum yield was relatively high, perhaps indicating they were milking the cows a little bit later than in our studies, but again did not differ across the 4 treatments, and neither did the colostrum solids concentration, which they used as a proxy of the colostrum quality or IgG content. So again, across the studies that are available, there's no clear picture that emerges relative to effects on either colostrum yield or colostrum quality. Now in sheep, we have a much larger body of research data available to look at colostrum, and there are more clear impacts of nutrition prior to parturition on colostrum quality and yield. And we understand that sheep are not just small cows, but I think they serve as a useful model to look at some of these factors. In this experiment, the researchers looked at the intake of metabolizable energy prior to lambing. And their way of measuring or estimating colostrum volume was to look at udder volume measured by a series of physical measurements, dimensions of the udder at the time of leading up to parturition and after parturition. So in this diagram, the udder volume is shown on the y-axis and the time relative to parturition on the x-axis. The open circles represent ewes that were fed 110% of their metabolizable energy requirement. The filled circles were ewes that were fed only 70% of ME requirements. And you can see there's a significantly lower volume, or presumably smaller colostrum yield, for the ewes that were deficient in energy intake before lambing. This is the same study and puts numbers on some of those figures just to show you that at birth, the amount of colostrum was considerably lower for the ewes that were deficient in energy relative to those that were adequate, but that after lambing, the differences in the amounts accumulated from lambing until 10 hours were quite similar between the 2 groups. So these were differences that were existing prior to parturition. Here's another study that looked at supplementation of corn grain during the last week before lambing, so similar to a steam-up type approach in dairy cows. So we have lambs that had a single lamb or twin lambs and fed either the control or the supplemented diets. Again, you can see that first of all, the twin, the ewes that were lambing with twins had more colostrum than the singlet lambs. And also the supplementation produced a significant increase in the amount of colostrum accumulated at parturition and also after parturition. So the total colostrum produced considerably larger for the supplemented ewes. In the same study, the percent protein at parturition, percent protein in colostrum at parturition was slightly lower for the supplemented lambs than for, or supplemented ewes than for the unsupplemented ewes, which is a little bit hard to figure out. Lactose was slightly greater, more energy in the colostrum, and the total protein secreted at parturition was greater because of the total volume increase. So here we have apparently a slightly lower colostrum quality or lower protein content with the supplementation, but because of the much greater volume of colostrum produced, there was still more total protein, presumably most of that, or a large portion of that, the IgGs in the colostrum. The authors attributed the increased colostrum and greater lactose from a mechanistic standpoint to a more rapid fall in progesterone before lambing in the supplemented ewes, which is the filled symbols here, solid symbols in the figure. So perhaps differences in how prepartum nutrition affects the hormonal levels could be involved in the amount of colostrum and its composition. In this study, the researchers looked at additional protein supply and its effect on colostrum yield and protein in ewes. So they increased dietary crude protein by providing more RUP in the moderate and high groups here. So the metabolizable protein supply increased from 100% of requirement up to 124%. Colostrum yield increased linearly here, although you can see the increases are fairly small in magnitude. Colostrum protein percentage also increased linearly, and as a result of those two, then there was more colostrum protein yield, particularly in the highest MP group before lambing. Finally, another study shows that both excesses and deficits of energy, or the plane of nutrition, interfere with colostrum synthesis in ewes. Here the ewes were fed 60, 100, or 140% of their energy requirements before lambing. Colostrum volume was depressed relative to the ewes that were fed at requirements for either the underfed or the overfed ewes, which is quite interesting. Colostral Ig concentration followed an opposite pattern, but was highest only with the low plane of nutrition ewes. The other two groups were not significantly different. The total mass of IgG followed the same trend as the colostrum volume, being highest for the group that was fed to requirements and lower for either underfed or overfed ewes prior to lambing. So what are the implications then of what we can put together from the sheep literature and the limited data available for cows? Data are just not as available for cows under the same extreme conditions as we have for the sheep. So I think the data from sheep indicate clearly that deficiencies of protein or energy may decrease colostrum yield, but also that excesses of energy may decrease colostrum yield and quality, and that boosting metabolizable protein supply may increase colostrum yield and quality. So dry period nutrition is a possibility, but it may not answer all of our questions about differences or problems in low colostrum yield. So what other factors might be responsible or might play into this? Milk yield, milking management, photoperiod, heat stress or other management stressors, ergot or mycotoxins, or something else that we've missed. Let's take a look at some of these factors. First of all, there's no clear relationship with first milking colostrum yield and milk production in the following 100 days. In other words, the milk producing ability of the cow. You can see in this study that first colostrum yield is not related to the subsequent accumulative production of milk in 100 days, either in multiparous cows or in primiparous cows or first calving heifers. Second volume milking declines because of a shorter interval since the first milking. So if we look at the first milking, the second milking following that is a lower yield, probably because of the shorter interval, and we take out that mass of colostrum that's accumulated over several days or weeks in the first milking. Primiparous and multiparous cows are different, as you might expect. The milk production increases more rapidly in the older cows and tends to be greater for older cows even in the initial milkings compared with first calving heifers. Just to put some of the correlations here in tabular form, the first colostrum yield is very weakly correlated with daily milk through day 14 in cows. So we can see that the correlations here are quite weak between going from day 5 up to day 14, and not significant at all in first calving heifers. One of the factors that we know plays a role in decreasing colostral IgG concentration is a delay or longer period to first milking. In this figure from Morin et al. 2010, as time after calving before the first milking increases, the general trend for IgG concentration in colostrum is downward. In other words, it's becoming more diluted with milk as the time increases before first milking. Colostrum IgG concentration also decreases with greater volume of first colostrum, which we've known for many years. Again, a factor of dilution or greater dilution of the colostral IgG. But again, if we look at the total IgG mass that is recovered, generally not affected by the interval to the first milking, because again, that's probably what is being regulated by the cow to be put into the mammary gland, and so is a product of both of those factors of concentration and yield, and the total mass is not affected by that interval to first milking. So some implications: higher yielding cows don't necessarily have more or less colostrum than herd mates, and we should be harvesting colostrum as soon as possible after calving for the highest quality colostrum for the calf. What about photoperiod? In a study conducted by Jeff Dahl when he was at the University of Illinois and colleague Don Morin, they showed no clear relationship with several different photoperiod scenarios, from long day, full photoperiod, short day, full photoperiod, or full dry period, or short day only during the close-up, or just ambient natural light. Quite a bit of variation again, as we've seen in all the other data that we've looked at. Colostral IgG concentration also was not affected by any of those different photoperiod scenarios. Other factors that may affect colostral IgG: if we have induced parturition, for example, giving dexamethasone, that will decrease colostral yield, as we talked about earlier. That causes cessation of the IgG transport into the mammary gland and the transition into milk production. Shortened gestations may decrease colostrum volume, and I put an asterisk there that we'll come back to in a minute. And severe management stressors that cause a cortisol or glucocorticoid response then may also decrease colostrum yield and colostral IgG concentration perhaps. So again, the general management features of avoiding overcrowding and other environmental stressors are important to maximize our chances of having a decent amount and good quality of colostrum. Heat stress, variable effects. In one study in Italy, they found that heat stress increased cortisol and then decreased colostrum in heifers. But a study from Florida found that heat stress had no effect on yield or concentration of colostrum. So the effect there is still somewhat unclear. Other possible factors that have not really been well quantified. Mycotoxins, a common solution for many problems, it seems. We know that ergot is an inhibitor of prolactin secretion, so that may decrease the dilution with milk volume, and so limit yield of colostrum. The other effects of other mycotoxins on colostrum have not been well explored. Short dry periods, we know leaking, mastitis or edema may have interfered with colostrum formation, inadequate water intake, or genetics and individual variation. All of these factors may or may not be involved in a particular situation of colostrum problem. I want to put this quote up from Baumrucker and Bruckmeyer, who are much more expert in this area than I. And I think it highlights that it's puzzling that we, at this stage in time, don't know more about colostrum, what is really regulating its volume, and how the concentration of IgG is controlled in colostrum. So to quote, "A disconnect between colostrum production and milk production suggests that colostrogenesis and mature milk production are separate and unrelated but overlapping processes. Currently, the source of this colostrum IgG1 variation is not well understood. Differential endocrine regulation has been suggested as a cause. We have hypothesized that a slow rate of IgG1 transfer coupled with variable length of the colostrum period among animals are contributors to this variation. Finally, genomic differences are also likely contributors." So, end quote. We know that even the experts here are still puzzled by a number of issues related to how colostrum is formed and regulated and what contributes to colostrum volume. So to summarize my findings and my gut feelings here about how we get these problems, I think that nutrition is likely important, certainly at the extremes. We don't want to be overfeeding or underfeeding energy during the dry period. We want to have adequate metabolizable protein supply, and I think striving for 1,300 grams per day in Holstein cows is a positive both for subsequent lactation performance, but also to ensure adequate colostrum formation. And we need to make sure that we have all the other immune-related nutrients, such as trace minerals and vitamins, in proper amounts in the dry period or close-up ration. A good dry period vaccination program will boost specific IgG and colostrum, provide that immunity towards the specific things vaccinated for, but we should remember that will not increase the total mass of IgG in the colostrum. Stress periods or conditions may accumulate if we have multiple stressors to cause more cows to have low colostrum production. So commonly we would see it after a period of summer heat stress or overcrowding, for example. Forage quality likely may contribute in terms of nutrient supply, but perhaps also mycotoxins that may form. We need to, as nutritionists, try to differentiate between something that appears to be just a transient effect that we'll never figure out and something that is a true herd issue or that occurs in the same herd year after year. And one thing that I think, back to my earlier asterisk that I called out, we need to look at days carried calf as a possible contributor to this phenomenon. And I say this because if we look at that time when the hormonal factors change to initiate colostrum formation, if we move the normal time of calving back by a day or two, then we have less time of those hormonal changes to cause accumulation of colostral volume within the mammary gland, and that may contribute to a lower colostrum yield. I've had some field nutritionists tell me that controlled energy dry cow programs or close-up programs may actually decrease on average the gestation length by a day or two. And if this is actually true, then we might have problems with lower colostrum volume during times when we're seeing a slightly shorter gestation length. those of you that are working with larger herds and good data, PC DART data and so on, can keep track of that and see if any of these events of low colostrum yield might be related to changes or seasonal differences in average days carried calf. So with that, that's what I can provide you on this topic. I think it's a fascinating topic that is of annoying importance in the field, at least from time to time. I'm sorry I don't have definitive answers for you, but I think this is the best state of knowledge on possibilities that may play into the problem, and I hope it gives you some areas to investigate and troubleshoot, or at least to help your producers understand the problem. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Jim, for the presentation. I'm sure we will have some good questions. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the 2020 Nutritionist and thank our 2019 sponsors. We will start the 2020 season in February, following the same formula, a recorded presentation played twice, 9 a.m. and 5 or 6 p.m., and the presentationer will join us after each presentation for questions. We do not yet have a finalized schedule, but I can tell you our speaker list will include Jesse Golf, Frank Mittler, Alex Bach, Jennifer Van Oos, Jude Clapper, Trevor DeVries, Bill Stone, Peter Yoder, Juan Velez, and Marty Traxler. Watch out for a couple special presentations next year, one of which will be Jim Drackley on calf recommendations. We will email you with a roster and topic list as soon as it is finalized. As you know, these webinars take a lot of work and cooperation. The webinars are organized and produced by AMTS, USA and Global. Our long-time collaborator is Paula Turillo of IFINA, and she hosts the series as El Webinar del Nutricionista. She receives support from Tecnal, Vinus Claden, Guillermo Lerman, and RR Lab in Argentina, and has the excellent translation skills of Paula Alanes backing her up. AMTS distributors in Italy, Elena Bonfante of Dairy Innovations Italia, in China, Sean Lee of Ansci Tech, in Brazil, Marcelo Hens Ramos of 3R Lab, and in Russia, Vadim Bekchevnikov of Novolab are occasional co-hosts. We are especially thankful to the generous sponsors who make it possible for us to get great speakers and manage the program. We are especially thankful to generous sponsors who make it possible for us to get great speakers and manage the program. We thank our gold sponsor, Arm & Hammer Animal Health, makers of cattle feed ingredients that optimize dairy cow health. Our silver sponsors are Ajinomoto Heartland, superior nutrition through amino acids, makers of AgiPro L, Dairyland Laboratories, Virtus, makers of Strata with EPA, DHA, omega-3s, and Prequel with omega-6s, Dairy One Forage Laboratory, and Jeffo, Life Made Easier. Our bronze sponsors are AminoMax, Purdue Agribusiness, Adiseo, Origination Inc., Novamil, Kemin, and PMI. Each of these companies support education and research worldwide. We hope that you consider them in your formulation decisions. I will now open the floor for questions. English language listeners, I will read your question. Remember to type your question in the Q&A tab or the chat window. Everybody, this is us live now. Dr. Drackley is here, and Jim, while I switch over to the actual slides presentation, you can go ahead and tell people where you are, because I don't think you're in the U.S. Am I correct?
Actually, I am. I'm in Chicago.
You're back. You're back. Good. I was a little nervous when I saw Akira posting.
Yes.
I was like, oh my gosh, he's in Japan. All right. So now you should be seeing the sponsor slide, but
Yes.
Jim, if we need to navigate to any particular slide in your slide deck, just let me know and I can do that.
Okay.
I have a lot of questions from our participant in Brazil. We have Marcos Nevepeira from the University Federal de Lavras, who isn't able to join us to actually ask questions, but he reviews the recording ahead of time and creates some questions based off that. I also have a question in our question and answer window, and if anybody out there listening has questions, go ahead and put them in the chat window, and I'll sort of circulate around to them. Jim, I'm going to start out with a question from Sarah Nolinger. And she says there was a recent study showing that multiparous cows are more affected by seasonal decreases in colostrum yield than primiparous cows. Do you have any idea why, and could hypocalcemia have an impact?
That's a very interesting suggestion. Certainly, because multiparous cows generally have greater colostrum yields than first lactation heifers, I think that's probably not surprising that they would be more affected by this. What we hear back from the field is certainly that it's more of a problem with older cows. Whether it's involved with calcium metabolism, either something directly due to calcium availability and action, or whether it's something caused indirectly by the hypocalcemia is certainly an interesting possibility. And I can't offer any specific mechanisms off the top of my head, but that's a good idea for somebody to track down.
Maybe slightly related to that, and this is purely anecdotal on my part. I've heard that possibly this is more of an issue in Jersey herds. Do you have any input on that?
Yeah, I think it kind of depends on who you talk to. I think I've heard from a number of people working with Jersey herds, but I've also heard from a lot with Holsteins. So I'm not sure if it's breed related or not, but you do hear that comment made.
Okay, and this is actually, we just got a question following that up. There was an ADSA or a Journal of Dairy Science, a Journal of Dairy Science paper in 2018 showed a number of factors affecting Jerseys, especially photoperiod. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, that was in my comments related to prolactin, and so it's possible there's some mechanism that is accentuated in the Jerseys, and it could be related to calcium since they're more prone to hypocalcemia.
Mm-hmm. Well, as everyone or people listening know, I love Jerseys, so that maybe is their only flaw. So a question, this is a question from Marcos, and this is a little bit of an odd question maybe here in the United States, but probably these sort of things happen, and we just don't talk about them. He said in Brazil, sometimes show heifers are given BST to induce growth of lean animals. Could it suppress mammogenesis in some animals? He has seen some that do not have much milk after calving. What are your thoughts?
Well, I've not heard that, and normally we would think from the work that's been done with BST that might end up accentuating milk yield or increasing subsequent milk yield from the few studies that were done in growing heifers, but it also may be a factor of the timing on when this is administered relative to the normal times of development and the different stages of development of mammogenesis.
Okay, thank you. This is a question, a comment on phytoestrogens present in different forages as a possible cause of transient lack of colostrum. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think we blame compounds like that and mycotoxins, things that may be transient accumulations in plants or forages. I'd say this somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but it seems like that's our default diagnosis when we can't figure anything else out. But the serious part of it is, I think there's a lot more issues that are related to things like that than we realize, or that we can actually quantify. There's so many different plant-derived chemicals that the plant may produce as a defense mechanism. So if we get into any challenge or stressor on the plants, they may start to produce greater concentrations of some of these compounds that have estrogenic or other hormonal activity, or the mycotoxins, and they may be transient. You may get a pocket in your bunker that contains the few plants in a small area that were affected by this, And so there's a number of plausible mechanisms that could cause these transient changes. And of course, we'll just never be able to track them down because they are transient.
Right. I was thinking that would probably be very difficult to figure out what exactly happened in that sort of case.
It seems with many cases like this that somebody will have a problem and identify it, talk to their nutritionist, and then by the time they get around to being able to implement anything, even it's already subsided or not as much of a problem. So it's a very frustrating situation sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Here's another question from Marcos. Assuming that supplying 100 grams of IG in a small volume of colostrum would be advantageous to absorption, what would be the maximum amount of colostrum you recommend? Partitioning the volume of colostrum half at calving and half 6 hours later, would that have a greater advantage on absorption?
Some of the early work did show a greater total absorption by doing that, by using high quality colostrum very soon after birth and then following within a relatively shorter time. I think as far as the maximum amount, I don't think you can get too much into the calf if you are doing it in multiple feedings like that. I think if we're using esophageal feeders, then we're more limited, obviously, by the capacity of the total stomach to about 4 liters or so in a Holstein. So I think that the fairly rapid or that's not the right term, a second feeding within 6 hours, as the question stated, may help to boost total absorption. But again, it's on larger farms, it becomes more problematic to do that.
This next question is somewhat of a follow-up to something you just referenced. Is there any evidence to suggest that calves receiving colostrum from a nipple would have a higher IG1 absorption than calves receiving it from a bucket or a stomach tube?
Mm-hmm. The studies that have been done to look at that really have shown very little difference between esophageal feeding and oral feeding. I'm not aware that anybody has looked at a bucket versus nipple, since the newborn calf would have to be to drink from an open bucket. I don't know of anybody that's looked at that. But from a nipple versus the esophageal feeder, the differences are small to non-existent.
I think in Dr. Van Amberg's talk this past March, he backed that up and said, "Just get it in them."
Yeah,
is the most important thing. Yeah.
A question. Get enough in.
Yeah. A question, what would your strategy be for dealing with low colostrum issues on a farm? Would you do it nutritionally by increasing RUP, checking energy levels, anything else?
Yeah, my first approach is always tell me about the energy content of your diet and what the intakes are. We check the metabolizable protein supply. And then look at the mineral, trace mineral package. And if those are usually the things that can be adjusted relatively quickly, and if it works, great. If not, then the other things are more difficult to solve through any actual implementation. Implementation. You can look at if there's any evidence of molds or anything unusual with the forages, and beyond that, it seems like again the seasonal factors that just kind of have to work their way through.
Okay, thank you. This is a question I'll try to get at what Marcos is saying. What would be reasonable goals for the average colostrum yield and quality in a farm, and for the portion of colostrum volume below 5 liters? And he has some follow-ups. Should the goals for mature and primiparous cows be different? And should the goals be different by breed?
I think the last question I would answer yes. I'm not sure I can give good goals for Jerseys versus Holsteins, but I think certainly you might expect a little bit less from Jerseys, and you probably need a little bit less for the calf. So reasonable goals, I think, the colostrum yield seems in general to have decreased over time. It's certainly affected by the time interval after calving before the colostrum is collected. And I think as producers are doing a better job of getting that colostrum collected sooner after calving, that's probably explains perhaps some of the decreased volume. Really, we're concerned with having enough to feed the calf, and would like to have the ability to put some away for later. So I think an average yield of 6 kilos across the herd is probably a practical management goal. Some farms would have probably closer to 10 kilos or 25 pounds of colostrum in some cows, but I think that 6 kilos of colostrum is a workable goal. If we had every cow produce that, we'd have enough for the calf, and we could still put some away. What were the other parts, Marianne?
Should the goals be different for mature and primiparous cows?
Yeah. I think, again, probably you're going to expect the mature cows to produce a little bit more than the first calving heifers. So if you're going to average 6 kilos, then maybe the older cows are at 7 or 8, and the heifers are at 5 to 6. We typically think of primiparous animals as having lower quality colostrum. Some of the surveys in the last decade or so have not necessarily backed that up, or haven't found as big a difference as some of the earlier work. But nevertheless, it's probably more likely that we would be saving or want to save excess colostrum from older cows. So I think if they're at 5 to 6 kilos of colostrum, that would certainly be adequate.
Okay, thank you. That part had a lot of parts. Let's see. This is somewhat related. You mentioned it in passing. What would be the best time period within which to milk a cow to achieve the ideal colostrum quality?
As soon as possible. That's, I think that's the best we can do. And I always try to encourage people that, if they're at 3 to 4 hours after calving, if we can move them up an hour, then that should help the colostrum quality. But the further we get out, the more dilution there is. So it may help on the volume side, but it may actually decrease the IgG content side.
Okay. Are there new and better tools to evaluate colostrum quality on the farm, and what do you recommend?
I think the use of the refractometers is really skyrocketed. That's a pretty handy method. I think from what I know, those are the most accurate and easy ways to do it. They've, in a lot of cases, replaced the old colostrometer hydrometer device. So I'm not aware of any other tests or systems that have come into the market, and I might be missing something, but I think the refractometers are certainly have become very popular.
And what would you consider a good range for the results?
Yeah, I think the reading is usually considered to be 22 Brix units or higher is good quality colostrum.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Let's see. This one's a fairly long one. Is colostrum volume correlated or not with colostrum quality? Baumrucker et al. In 2010 versus Morin et al. In 2010. In the latter's work, it looked like one data point made the slope of the regression negative. Old data, Pritchett et al. In 1991, suggests there was a relationship between colostrum volume and quality. In this data set, 20% of the cows produced less than 4.5 kilograms of colostrum. Could you comment on that? And do you want me to paste that whole thing over into the chat?
No, I think I can.
Okay.
I can deal with that. So, I do remember the situation that is mentioned there, with the one data point appearing to be a highly influencing data point, and whether perhaps different analytical techniques, statistical techniques, might have excluded that value or something. I don't know. So the one thing that we have to be careful with is small data sets used to evaluate this, because the variability is so large that you really need to have bigger data sets to demonstrate those relationships. And in general, I think they still hold true, that the higher the volume, the lower the colostrum quality. But again, it's difficult to know, because in most of the cases, the time of milking would not have been standardized, and so it's confounded by time after milking, as well as cows that just for some other reason would have greater colostrum volume. I think the one thing to remember is that the mass, if we look at the total mass of IgGs, so the product of volume times concentration, that seems to be less variable, so that any changes in volume with time after milking would be expected to decrease the IgG concentration.
Okay.
And then the 25% below 4.5 kilos or something like that.
Yeah, 4.5. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, and so that was a nice field study at the time that had a lot of cows and looked at the distribution of colostrum yields, and I don't expect things have changed too much now, except maybe to get a little bit worse. And again, we want to try to maximize the ability of our average cow to produce a little bit more colostrum, and beyond that, again, it gets back to some of the things that we talked about in the webinar.
Okay, thank you. Do you have thoughts on why the colostrum yield of primiparous cows is less compared to multiparous?
Well, I think some of it is related to the same factors that, why we have lower milk production in heifers and cows. We have less mammary development and growth in the first lactation than in subsequent lactations. So I would expect that the mechanisms that are involved in transfer of immunoglobulins, and then the turning on of the synthesis that provides the volume of liquid drawn in, lactose synthesis, I would expect those processes maybe not as mature or functioning at the same level as they will in subsequent lactations.
Okay, thank you. So in your presentation, you talked about the fact that there wasn't much information on the effect of nutrition on colostrum and yield and quality in dairy cows. So you think relying on the sheep data is a good way to keep it as a possibility?
I think so. I mean, there's, again, a frustrating lack of information, studies that we can draw on that have the same range of variables or same range of experimental treatments applied to the cows as we have in the sheep. Certainly cows and sheep are very different in many ways, but I think the basic principles of mammogenesis and lactogenesis, colostrum synthesis are similar between the two species. And the values that I showed today from the sheep in many cases were pretty severe changes in nutritional status. So going from 60% of requirements to 140% is a bigger range than most studies we have available in cows, and certainly a bigger range than I hope we're seeing in most reasonably managed farms today. So it's difficult. We would really have to go in and deliberately try to make those extremes in cattle and see if we could have enough cows to detect the results. And I'm not aware of those studies, and it would be nice to have them. But I think in the meantime, we can take some inferences from the sheep data.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, we have a couple more here. These are all coming from Marcos, and it's great that he feeds me these questions. Let's see, what could you do to increase mammary gland development immediately postpartum? Is there a way to effectively manipulate that?
No, I mean, the things that we do in a transition cow or the close-up cows to try to get cows off to a good start are the only ways that we know of. Certainly programs that prepare the cow well. We have many cases where cows by 4 days after calving will be producing 45 kilos of milk. And those things that are involved in preparation for lactation of the close-up cows, talking about energy supply, protein supply, and vitamins and minerals, the DCAD program, all those things are preparing the cow to stay healthy and get off to a quick start. And that's going to be working through mammary development to get the number of secretory cells going as quickly as possible. So to say there's any magic bullet or magic solution, no, I don't think so. Anything other than just good close-up cow management.
Okay, thank you. So some of the parts of this next question you've already answered, so I won't repeat them. But can you comment on the possible effect of prepubertal weight gain on subsequent mammary gland development and milk yield?
Prepubertal
Yes.
game, yeah. So this has always been an area of concern for heifers, and I think Mike Van Amberg's studies with Matt Meyer a few years ago have kind of provided, in my opinion, a definitive answer to that the accumulation of mammary DNA or cell number seems to be more of a time-dependent function, so that if a heifer is growing more rapidly, they will have less time to accrete those same number of cells than a slower growing heifer. But those heifers are calving at a younger age, so they may have a lower number of secretory cells at that particular time during growth. That may explain the effects of higher growth rates on this idea that we're affecting or impairing mammary parenchymal development. So it's a factor that they're just more. They're larger. They're a larger percentage of their mature size at a given weight during growth, during this prepubertal phase, for example. But that's not impairing normal development. I think most of the studies that documented decreases or larger decreases than you would expect based on the age of calving in heifers grown very rapidly are due to the improper growth. So getting too much fat deposition, and the idea that goes along with that is that heifers were depositing fat in the mammary pad, and that was going to replace mammary tissue, and that was evidenced by the lower DNA as a proxy for that. However, if we're getting fat deposition in the mammary gland, there's no mechanism that would specifically result in more fat accumulating in the mammary gland without it accumulating everywhere else in the body. So I think we're quite simply growing them too rapidly without adequate metabolizable amino acid supply, so that we're increasing just general fattening. And we all know that fatter heifers have more problems and don't milk as well as a properly conditioned heifer at calving. So in summary of that, I think the idea that prepubertal growth is a dangerous time for mammary development has been largely disproven. And if we're using the technologies we have to grow heifers more rapidly, but with adequate protein to prevent fattening, we don't see those negative effects.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I that information on it's more or less post-weaning feeding of heifers is always very, very fascinating.
Yeah.
Let's see, a couple more that are a little bit outside the scope of today's talk, but maybe you want to comment on them. This is speaking a little bit to that paper that you referenced, or the research that you referenced that Mike Van Amberg did. The effect of milk volume during the wet calf phase of a calf and its future milk production in the first lactation.
Yeah.
And what would be your recommendation of volume of milk per day? And then it gets into whether calves should be raised individually, in pairs, or in groups. And these are all sort of hot topics that have been covered in talked about in calf planning.
Yeah, so I'm a big believer in more milk. I think the concerns are not founded as far as how that may affect or impair long-term development. I think everything that we have and continue to accumulate indicates positive effects on mammary development and future milk yield. There's been several studies now from Virginia Tech that have shown evidence of enhanced early mammary development, and certainly accumulating studies that show positive effects on milk production, or at least neutral effects. So, if there were some negative effects out there, we should be seeing them come up in some studies, but we don't. Everything is, neutral to positive, which means the center of that distribution is likely positive. So I think that as far as amounts, I think that's largely a factor of what the producer can implement and make successful. There's still people that struggle to feed large volumes of milk a day, a kilo of solids, for example, or more. For them, a more moderate approach might be easier to implement, but I think we've got to move away as an industry towards greater milk production, or greater milk feeding as a minimum than what we have in the past. I'm missing one part of that question.
Let's see. It was actually in regards to how calves do in their housing, whether it should be individual, in pairs, or groups.
Yeah. Well, as the data continue to accumulate there's ample evidence that calves raised together socially, either in pairs or groups, have some advantages in terms of expressing their natural behaviors and so on, and some peer learning or training kinds of concepts that they seem to come on to dry feed sooner and so on. I think from if we think of something like mob feeders as a group feeding system, there's probably some more issues involved there, particularly with weaning those calves. You have to have calves of a similar age together in order to decrease the total amount of milk that's being offered. Is about the only way you can step those calves down to make the weaning transition easier. Automated feeders, when they're installed in good facilities with adequate ventilation, are a tremendous tool to manage large volumes of milk and the adaptation, and then the step down towards weaning. But again, that's, they have to be implemented properly as well. So I think there's certainly some advantages been demonstrated with pair or group housing relative to individuals. I think in terms of economics, those are probably fairly modest changes, but from behavior, animal welfare concerns, I think there'll be increasing pressure for us to raise calves that way.
Yeah, I attended a talk this fall, and the speaker basically said he foresees that individual housing of calves will be our next tail docking.
Could be, yeah.
Well, if I don't get any more questions from our attendees, I'm going to say that we are probably good for the morning, and plan to meet with you, Jim, again tonight.
Okay.
All right. And I want to thank everybody for attending. I look forward next year to when you'll be able to talk to us about new recommendations. And it's very excited to pull you in on a special conversation next year. So
I look forward to that too. Yeah.
Yeah. In the meantime, I hope everybody has good holidays and doesn't get too cold this winter if they're in cold places, and we'll talk to you again in February. Jim, I'll talk to you tonight.
All right. Thank you,
right.
everybody.
Thank you for sharing, or thank you for coming. Bye. Okay, I'm going to switch over to the slides so that if we need to go to a slide for better explanation, we can do so. All right, if anybody has any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat window. Paula, do you want to ask on your own, or are you busy doing translating?
Hi, no, I can ask.
Oh, very good.
Okay. Hi, Jim.
Hello.
The first question is from Agostina. She's asking if we can supplement with an additive during periods of hot stress to avoid this lower colostrum production.
Well, excuse me, that would be a great solution if it were that easy. Unfortunately, I don't know of any additives that would correct the problem. Certainly that beyond the adjustments in nutrition, we don't have any identification of additives of any sort that would be able to counteract the problem, at least at this time.
Oh, okay.
All right. Paula, do you have more questions, or shall I take a few?
Please take a few and then I will go on.
Oh, okay. All right. Very good. Jim, I have a question. What would you recommend as the best source of MP, or just a general boost in MP?
Yeah, I think the general idea there is just to make sure that we're meeting the requirements for the close-up cows. And, we probably should be looking even more closely at metabolizable lysine, metabolizable methionine as the most limiting amino acids in MP. So I think whatever that we're doing to try to boost those essential amino acids is, as far as we know, the applicable principle there.
Okay, thanks. I have a question. This is from one of our morning listeners who has returned to hopefully hear the answer. It's fairly detailed, and you may benefit from doing a better answer for him in a personal email, but I'm going to go ahead and give a shot at sort of saying what it's saying. Mm-hmm. So he heard you say that 1,300 grams MP was recommended for good colostrum production. He looked up a diet for a herd that he's feeding that has had colostrum quantity challenges intermittently with no pattern, and it affects all lactations, including virgin heifers, all at the same time, and then goes away just as fast with no explanation. Mm-hmm. His close-up diet has 1,245 grams of MP balanced for a 1,550 pound body weight cow, and the description of 270 days pregnant. The diet is set for 29 pounds dry matter intake, and the pen eats consistently no matter if the colostrum quality is high or low, which includes the virgin heifers. Straw is cut short, and there isn't a sorting problem. His question is that the requirement shows 1,053 grams MP, and this diet has already 0.33 pounds of blood meal in it with 1245 gram MP. Is raising this to 1300 going to cure the problem?
Well,
it's a lot of words. Do you need to see that
no,
in the chat?
No, I think I'll give it a shot here and just say that if the questioner wants to correspond with me privately, that would be fine. I think that I suspect it's probably unlikely that just boosting that 50 more grams of MP is going to solve the problem. It sounds like the questioner has things pretty well under control. I guess, I would ask about if the where the energy density is, to make sure that with that high an intake, they're still not consuming too much energy. But in general, from the initial description, it sounds like that nutrition may not be a problem, and it could more likely be some transient factor in the forages, the mycotoxins or the phytoestrogens, or something that's causing the problem. But again, I'd be glad to correspond to share more information and more ideas.
I forwarded his email to you. He did an excellent job of describing what his situation was. So
all right, I'll take a look.
You two can get together. I have a question from Brenda. What is the optimal level of crude protein as a percent of dry matter and energy and mcals per kilogram for 3/3 gestation in sheep? I'm not sure what 3/3 gestation is, but maybe you do.
Well, regardless of what that means, I'm not going to be able to answer it because I'm not a sheep person. But I would suspect that as a percentage of diet, they're probably not too far off of what we would do for cows. But again, crude protein is not the best descriptor, and I'm just not familiar with the energy requirements of sheep, so I have to apologize and say I can't answer that.
Triplets, maybe. So yeah, did you come across any research that showed any correspondence to carrying multiple calves or sheep and corresponding at all to the colostrum quality or production?
Well, we had the one slide that looked at that compared twins or single lambs, and it seems that in that study the colostrum yield was greater for the ewes that were carrying the twins. So that's an interesting insight into the regulation, perhaps, that mom knew that she needed to make more. But beyond that, I have seen no information in cattle in that regard.
Okay, thank you. Paula, would you like to ask some questions that you have?
Yes. The second question from Nestor: which is the minimum recommended metabolizable protein for young animals before their first lactation?
Well, that's going to change as the heifers are growing over time. So it's difficult for me to give a number for that. Again, using a program like AMTS, you can find the MP requirements during growth for different ages, different sizes of heifers, plus different rates of gain. So that's going to be dependent on the size and the rate of gain that's being programmed.
Nestor, I think we had some former webinars maybe that covered some of that. So look back through our archives, or if you have access to Paula's archives, that might be helpful. Paula, do you want to keep going?
Yes, of course. The third question is, could selenium supplementation increase colostrum quality?
There was quite a bit of attention given to selenium for a while, and there were some positive studies that suggested maybe there was a particular relationship there. But as far as I know, those studies have kind of faded here, and of course we're still limited by legal restrictions in most countries. So that aspect is I'm not certain where that is right now in terms of any process of getting additional regulatory approval to a bolus or something of selenium, but as far as I know, there hasn't been a lot of follow-up on that work from a few years ago. We certainly want to make sure that we're providing the maximum that we can in the ration.
Okay, we are allowed to feed selenium as much as we want here. We don't have a restriction. Okay.
That's a problem.
Yes. The fourth question, can a high level of feed mycotoxins in close-up cows go to colostrum? And if so, can this cause health issues for the calf?
Oh, that's a very good question. I would assume that that mycotoxins could get into the colostrum if there was a sufficiently high level coming from the rumen at the time of colostrum formation. But I don't remember seeing any documentation of that. As far as the effects on the calf, young animals are generally considered to be more sensitive to aflatoxin or other mycotoxins perhaps. So we certainly don't want to be feeding a lot of mycotoxins to the young calf, particularly at the age when they're absorbing things from the gut. So interesting question.
Okay.
Great.
Paula, do you have more, Paula, or should I?
No, by now I don't have more.
Okay. I have a question from this morning, and this is, let me find which one. Okay. What comments do you have on ways to measure what to measure in calves to evaluate the colostrum program on a farm, and what would be the best goals or values for that?
I think still the gold standard would be looking at IgG in blood at 48 hours or somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 or 4 days after calving to try to be consistent on the age when you measure that. And the IgG measurement would be the gold standard. We'd like to see that above 10 milligrams per liter, or milligrams. Oh, I always get the units. Grams per deciliter. And the higher above that, probably the better. But that's been kind of the cutoff for indicating failure of passive transfer. We can use total proteins, serum or plasma proteins, as we do at birth, but again, they're not as specific for transfer of the immunity. The values there, again, are above 5.5 to 5.6 protein after 24 hours. So those are still the gold standard measurements as far as looking at success of the actual biological transfer.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Paula, unless you have more questions, I do not have any more questions in my chat window.
No, I don't.
Okay. All right. Very good. Well, Jim, thank you so much for joining us. I was glad that you were able to fit this in. I know that everybody was really happy that you could join us. I had a huge response to people wanting to join the webinar.
No, thank you
and
very much.
We look forward to next year when you'll be able to present on new recommendations.
Okay.
All right. And you were thinking that might be in the March, April time frame?
Yeah, somewhere in there, I think, as it looks now.
Sounds great. What we'll do is we're actually going to make that a special outside of the usual nutritionist webinar. So I'll make sure everybody that has joined this particular webinar is notified, and there'll also be a general mailing that will go out.
Okay.
So sounds good.
Very good.
Paula and Paula, thank you for joining me this year.
Thank you very much.
All right. And everybody, thank you all for attending. Jim, have a wonderful evening, and everybody have delightful holidays. We'll see you hopefully again in February.
All right. Thanks,
All right.
everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.